Hello and welcome to my March reading wrap-up. March was a bit of an iffy month for me on BookTube. I was not around much and I missed a lot of videos, so... But I did read. I read 11 books in March, 7 of which were physical, so I'm very pleased with that. Only 4 were off of my shelves, which could have done better, but I had to read several library books for my 12-book project for 2023, and then also one that I thought might be a favorite and was, so I can't really be mad at that one because it's my one 5-star book of the year so far. Also chopped off my hair and it's kind of uneven, but that's fine. But getting into the 11 books I read so that this doesn't wind up being a 40-minute video, it probably will. The first book I read was Transmission: My Quest to a Beard by Bertie. This is a YA nonfiction book about a trans man. He was a YouTuber. I don't think he posts anymore. I looked up his YouTube and the last video was like a year ago. So he's probably like active on Twitch or something. That seems to be where most of them migrated. But he was a YouTuber. He's trans. He's from the UK. The book is just like about him and his life. It's part memoir, part like teen self-help advice stuff, part just like basic information on trans men. I didn't write this because going in I really thought it was going to be a memoir, and like I knew it was young adult, but I really thought it was going to be like his memoir, just like for a teen audience. And it wound up being a lot more like advice for teens and stuff like that. And it's like there was a whole, section on dealing with bullies and stuff like that. And like, he didn't write this book for a 30-year-old cis woman. And that's not like the book's problem. That was my problem. I really enjoyed the parts of this that were more like memoir focused and about his life, but they were, I don't know, kind of sparse and kind of like minimal throughout the book. So it just wasn't for me. Like, I think it's a good book for like middle school and high school libraries and like for young trans teens and like their parents and teachers and guidance counselors. But like for the average audience, I don't think there's really enough there. But again, that's not the book's fault. I was just reading something that was very much not targeted towards me. Then I read The Baker's Daughter by Sarah McCoy. This is a dual timeline book. Half of it is set in the 1930s and 40s in Germany, and then half of it is set in present day, or like, present day 12 years ago when this was published. But it basically ties together a young woman during Nazi Germany and then a young woman in Texas in the mid-2000s and their lives, and it kind of draws some parallels between Mexican immigration to the US and Nazi Germany, or like it tries to. I gave this 2 stars. I was thoroughly unimpressed. I wrote a really long Goodreads review on this, but to be honest, I don't know how much I really care to talk about it here. Like, it wasn't really good in any aspect. I hated the main character in the contemporary timeline. She was so annoying and insufferable, and I think we were supposed to like connect with her flaws and like, oh, she's a real person, but she was just so shallow and annoying. Like, I did not care. And then like it tried to like have some discussions on immigration, but then like it never actually discussed anything like in terms of like immigration or Nazism. Like, no discussions on anything. It was just, it like set it up like it was going to, and then it just kind of left it there. And it kind of did that with everything. Like, there were some serious topics in this book. Like, at one point the main character finds out that her father, who was in the US military, raped people while he was in the military in the country he was in. And like, it kind of brought that up, and then it kind of just dropped it without like doing anything with that information. And it's like, I'm totally fine with that being here, but like, can we please discuss that? Like, can it matter if it's just going to be thrown into this book? And there was a lot that was kind of like that, where it was just kind of like tossed in without it really mattering or meaning anything or being discussed. And it didn't seem like a very well thought out book. Like, she had an idea of what she wanted it to be, but then she didn't actually do the work to make it that, kind of. I had kind of a similar issue to the historical timeline that I do in a lot of books about Nazi Germany, where it just totally dehumanizes the Nazis as like monstrous sadists. And like, I'm not saying that like I want the Nazis to be heroes or anything like that, but like one of the scariest things about Nazi Germany is that it wasn't a country of like 4 million sadists or whatever, however many people it was. I don't know. But like it wasn't just like millions of sadists who liked hurting people for the sake of hurting people. It was like average people who were put into a scenario where they all collectively did monstrous things. And like it kind of limits any discussion you can have when they're all just sadists who just like causing pain for the sake of it. And like that's kind of what this book was. Like this Nazi dude was just like raping his friend's fiance and is like, what? like I mean, and it was kind of like they were all kind of like that. And I get very tired of books that do that because again, it inhibits any discussion that you can possibly have about the time period. Like, I'm not saying treat them like they were good people. I'm saying like treat them like they were just kind of average individuals who did monstrous things for reasons other than just like sadism. Because like that's, I don't know, that's just kind of, it seems like a very shallow way to discuss it to me, which I felt like was a lot of this book. And my only other thing, okay, the thing that made me the most angry in this whole book, this is the pettiest thing, but I have to talk about it because it really made me angry. The main character is from the same city I am, Richmond, Virginia. And at one point in this book, she wears a Flying Squirrels jersey, which is the baseball team here. However, the baseball team here was not the Flying Squirrels in 2008 when this book is set. And it's like, there's no way she could be wearing a Flying Squirrels jersey when the Flying Squirrels did not become the baseball team until 2010. And like, I get that no one else reading this book will notice that or care, but it bugged me because I was reading this like, there's no way this was 2008 and she's wearing a Flying Squirrels jersey. Because like, I was in middle school in 2008 and I know for a fact that the Flying Squirrels weren't announced until I was in high school. And like, how hard is it to just do your research and just Google that as a quick fact? Like Google it. Like, you had to Google it to like know what the team was, I assume, because she doesn't live in Virginia anymore. So I assume she had to check on that. Like, can you just check a little further to get the dates right? Like, I get that doesn't matter. And it didn't like affect my rating for this book at all, but it's just so annoying to me. And it's just like, I spent 10 minutes just like raging about that. Like, but this was not very good. It was very short, and that was kind of like the best part of it. The historical timeline was more interesting than the contemporary timeline, but again, it kind of dealt with things very shallowly, and again, did not really care that much. So it was kind of an unfortunate book all around. Then I read an ebook, a short story collection, All Out, the No Longer Secret Stories of Queer Teens Throughout the Ages, which is a young adult short story collection, edited by Sandra Mitchell, but it contains a lot of authors of various queer identities. Good variety, good diversity. I gave it 3 stars. There were 2 stories in here that I really loved. Anna Marie McLemore and Elliot Wake both had wonderful stories that I loved, but to be honest, apart from those 2, I found everything else kind of just like middle of the road. Like, nothing was bad. I think there was like 1 or 2 stories in this book that annoyed me. Most of them were nice reads, incredibly forgettable, cannot discuss any of them. But there were 2 that I loved, so like, I thought about giving it 4 stars, but that seems a little generous. I think it's worth the read. It was a little bit like more magic-y than I thought. Like, I really thought it was going to be like straight historical fiction, and there was a lot of like kind of magical elements thrown in, which I didn't love. I think mostly because I wasn't expecting that. Like, you're looking at this, reading it like it's like realistic fiction, and then all of a sudden someone's like teleporting, and it's like, what's going on? So I didn't love that element. And again, a few of the stories were annoying. Most of them were fine. And then this definitely made me want to read more from Anna Marie McLemore and Elliot Wake, because those were both wonderful. And they were both retellings. One was Little Red Riding Hood. That was Anna Marie McLemore's. It was the first story in the book, and it was just like a great way to start the book. And then Elliot Wake's story was a retelling of Robin Hood that was really good. And I was like, I would like for him to write a lengthier story about that, because that was a wonderful story. But fantastic. So worth it for those two. If you like young adult historical fiction short stories, you'll probably enjoy this. I had a good time. Then I listened to The Stranger in the Woods, The Extraordinary Story of the Last True Hermit by Michael Finkel, which I gave 2 stars. I did not have a good time with this book. This is a nonfiction book about a man who was a hermit, basically, in Maine. He lived on his own for like 27 years in the wilderness, not talking to anybody, just like on his own. No one knew where he was, no one knew he was there, really. And he basically subsisted by stealing from people in the community. Like, not big things, but like, he'd steal food, he'd steal like batteries, he'd steal, you know, little things to like keep his life going. And this is just about him, and I found it a thoroughly unpleasant book to read. Not so much for the subject matter, but it was, my biggest issue was that there's a lot of problems with consent between the author and the subject, in that the subject did not really seem to want anything to do with the author, to escalating to the degree that he threatened to call the cops if the author ever showed up and bothered him or his family again. He did technically consent to the book, and there were multiple interviews he sat through where he could have walked away. When he was in jail, the author showed up unannounced, uninvited. The dude did not seem pleased to see him, but the dude did talk to him for like hours at a time, several different times. So like, he did consent to that. But then it was like, after he got out of jail, he kept telling the author to leave him alone, to leave his family alone. Like, the family told him to leave him alone. Like, he got very angry at him. And like, Michael Finkel did not listen. And this mostly seemed like a dude who was desperate to revive his career as a writer, because he ruined his career earlier when he lied in an article that he wrote for, I think, like, the New York Times, maybe? I don't remember, but he lied and got caught lying in an article. And I don't think he lied in this book, but it was like, it definitely vibed like a man whose career was failing and he was just desperate for a really good story to save it. And then beyond that, that made me feel really gross. To talk about the actual book, it kind of just seemed like he didn't have enough information to write this book. Like, because the dude, the subject, I don't remember his name. Did I write his name down? Knight. Christopher Knight. Because Christopher Knight was not super down to be interviewed, he didn't get necessarily tons of information from him. And to write a book like this, I felt like he needed a lot more. And he was kind of supplementing this book with like his own ideas on like what Knight was feeling and like the inspiration behind it, what it truly meant in the world, and then like interviewing people involved in the case and like people from the community. And it just seemed like he was trying real hard for a book that he didn't quite have a grasp on. Christopher Knight seemed like an interesting person, but the whole book made me feel gross, and like, it's one of those books that I just really regret having read. It did not make me feel good. I didn't appreciate it. Would not recommend. It wasn't worthwhile, and then the whole issue with consent was just absolutely gross to me. And then I read Earthlings by Sayaka Murata, which was my first 5-star read of the year. Absolutely wonderful book. I fell in love. It was beautiful. It's an adult contemporary novel about a young girl who is abused by her family, who is sexually abused at school, who is struggling a lot with just like surviving, and she turns to a coping mechanism, which is essentially believing that she is an alien from outer space. She doesn't belong here. She doesn't relate to people, not because of the trauma, but because she is an alien who needs to go home. And the book kind of centers around that, and like partially in her childhood and partially in her adulthood. And it's a really beautiful, lovely story that kind of devolves a little bit into like some horror gore and cannibalism and fun things, which I mostly only mention because like it's a lot. Like, it is very graphic, and I wasn't really expecting it, because it does take a turn from like this really like serious, realistic story into like this kind of extreme gore situation, which I think was wonderfully done. Like, I've never read a book that felt like two different books, but still like flowed together so smoothly, and it's like you couldn't have one without the other. Like, you needed both of these parts, but like so wildly different, and just, oh, 5 stars, wonderful. I fell in love. I adored the realness of the first part of the book, like just inside this poor abused girl's head, of just like her trying to cope with her reality, which is just such a hard situation. And then you see her as an adult, and the way she's really never let go of these coping mechanisms, and like the way it is in some ways so unhealthy, and in some ways almost healthy in certain like aspects. And like you see everything she's been through, you see everything she does, and you see the way it just takes that turn into horror, and it's like so absolutely disgusting to read. Like, this book has a lot of trigger warnings, and if you care, please go look them up, because there's a lot going on here. Again, I just mentioned the cannibalism because it's a lot of cannibalism. It's a lot. I was gonna do a full review on this, but then it's like really hard to talk about without talking about like a bunch of spoilers, but it's just a beautifully written book. I adore Sayaka Murata. I read Convenience Store Woman by her a few years back, and that was one of my favorite books of the year, and then I read this, and like this is one of my favorites. So like I just need to read more from her. I don't think that this book would have quite as wide appeal as Convenience Store Woman, because it does kind of, it goes a little bit further than Convenience Store Woman does into like the weird and absurd, and I think it works beautifully. I think this is an absolutely gorgeous book that I need to buy and own and reread. Highly recommend if it sounds like you might be able to sit through this, but I know it's not for everyone. Then I guess because I had my first 5-star read of the year, I needed to have my first 1-star read of the year, and I read Last Call by Warren Adler, which was my biggest disappointment because I had such high expectations for this book. I so badly wanted to love this. This is kind of romance between an 83-year-old man and an 80-year-old woman. He's a widower, his wife passed away, and he's kind of elderly, living on his own. And he meets this woman at a dog park. They both have standard poodles, and they get to talking and like start a relationship and fall in love. And then he finds out later on that she's not actually a widow, like she said. Her husband is alive and suffering from Alzheimer's, and she is his primary caregiver. And it kind of delves into that. And again, 1 star. This sounded like a beautiful story. I was so excited. And then the more I was reading, the more I was like, I don't get along with this writing style. It definitely needed more editing. It's a self-published book, and it needed that second pass of editing, because there was a number of times where it'd be things like a person is having like a conversation, and they're like sitting down during that conversation, just like in a chair, and then like a couple paragraphs later it'll be like, oh, this person sat down in the chair, and it's like, well, they were already sitting. Like, it needed another pass, because it wasn't just like one occurrence, it was a number of times, and there were like sentences that were like repeated. Like, it needed another pass. And the romance itself is super insta-lovey. Like, I get that the characters are old and they talk about that, and they're like, hey, like, I'm all in on this because like I'm probably not going to live another 10 years. Like, I'm already in my mid-80s. Let's be realistic here. But it is like they meet at a dog park, and within a couple of days they're expressing their love for each other, and it was a little bit much. Like, it didn't feel like the relationship was developed and really like earned. Like, I wanted to really care, I wanted to feel for these characters, and I didn't. And then the Alzheimer's husband thing was like barely discussed. Like, I thought that was going to be the driving force of this book, and it wasn't. Like, the dude didn't care. He was like, well, it's kind of weird you lied to me, but like, he has Alzheimer's, like, he's mentally gone basically, so like, I don't really care. I just think you should put him in a home and move in with me. And like, that was the primary conflict in terms of the Alzheimer's storyline. I thought it was going to be very emotional, and it wasn't. Like, the woman was sad about it. She's like, oh, like, it's breaking my heart, like, it's so sad. And the dude was just like, put him in a nursing home and move in with me. That's what I want. And it was kind of treated as more like a nuisance than like this thing they're really struggling with. The sex scenes were also really graphic, which I didn't love. And it was written in like a really gross way. Really, it wasn't necessarily the issue that they were graphic. It was more of the way they were written felt like kind of porny. Like, I've read more graphic sex scenes in books, which, like, I don't really love graphic sex scenes anyway, but like they felt right for the characters, they felt right for the story, they flowed well, and it's like, whatever, like, I don't care. But in these, it just felt gross. Like, the way they were written felt like fetishy, kind of like he was writing out, like the author was writing out his own fantasies and like enjoying it, and it just like gave me a gross vibe that I didn't really enjoy. And the female character in this giggled constantly. Like, every time dude said something, she giggled. Like, and I counted once, and it was 11 times in 3 pages. Like, whenever they'd have a conversation, her response was always to giggle at everything he said. And like, I normally don't get hung up on things like that, but it was constant. Like, 11 times in 3 pages is a lot. Like, that's so much. And then, okay, I've been complaining a lot. I hated this book. My main issue, this would have been 2 stars without this issue, but this was the one issue that drived it down to 1. The anti-Semitism in this book. This book is largely about anti-Semitism, intentionally. Warren Adler is Jewish, or raised Jewish, and it is about anti-Semitism. Sarah, the love interest, is a Jewish woman, and Harvey, the main dude, is not. He is anti-Semitic. Doesn't really realize it throughout the book, and his wife was incredibly anti-Semitic, to the degree that like he's patting himself on the back for telling her to keep her anti-Semitism in private. His deceased wife, I should say. It's like constant throughout the book, and it is like kind of discussed. I don't think it's discussed very well, but it's intentional. But then we get to a point where Harvey gets angry at Sarah once because he's going through a hard time, and he wants to talk to her, and she doesn't pick up her phone for like 12, 18 hours. She just isn't picking up her phone, and he gets angry. He gets angrier and angrier, and then he leaves her a message that is filled with just like anti-Semitic rants, slurs. It's very sexist. It's like really awful to read. Like, it was not like a subtle thing. It was like, I can't believe you people are all like this, yada yada yada. Like, it was really bad. But this is a romance novel, so you know how it's going to end, and it was irredeemable for me. Like, if your first reaction in anger is to bring up bigotry and use slurs and say those kind of things and be anti-Semitic at them, it's because you are anti-Semitic. And it wasn't ever really like delved into. Like, he apologized, but he was like, yeah, like, I'm sorry, I don't know where this anti-Semitism came from, like, it was out of nowhere, I wouldn't do it again. And I was just like, that's irredeemable for me. Like, that was like the line. This would have gotten 2 stars had he died sad and alone the way he deserved, but like, it's a romance novel, so he was never going to do that. Thoroughly unpleasant. It's just like, it was disgusting. Like, it was so gross. I did not want them to wind up together. I didn't even like Sarah as a character, but she deserved so much better than him. Like, the way he treated her was awful. The anti-Semitism was never discussed to the degree that it really needed for how much of it was in this book and for how much it was the driving force of this book. And it's just like, you leave someone a hate-filled message like that, you can't just come back from that with an apology. And it needed so much more. And like, it was gross. I would not recommend. I was gonna do a full review on this, and then I just like didn't want to talk about it. Like, I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't feel like it deserved the time. I know I've given it too much time here, but like, it was an unpleasant read. Would not recommend. So it's leaving my shelf very quickly. And then my last unpleasant read of the month. Everything after this is very positive. Chaos by Patricia Cornwell. I gave 2 stars. I'm not entirely certain why I gave it 2 stars. I feel like I could have given it 1, but I gave it 2. This is a thriller. It is the 24th book in the K. Scarpetta series. I read the first one and I decided to skip ahead because I didn't like the first one, and I was like, let's see if like her writing gets better later on, if I enjoy more things later on. Did not. This, I don't even know how to describe the book. Nothing happens. Nothing happened. Like, it's a cop thriller. The woman is a, what's the word? Mortician? Not mortician. I'm blanking on the word. She's the doctor that checks out dead bodies for the police who've been murdered. I don't know why I'm blanking on the word. I'm dumb. And she is going to dinner with her husband and gets a call that there is a body of a woman who was on a bike and goes to investigate that. And that is the first 300 pages of this book. I'm not exaggerating. I wish I was exaggerating. She doesn't even like touch the dead body until more than 200 pages in. Like, I don't know what to say. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. This is the slowest book I've ever read. Nothing happened. Like, slow implies, I like slow, but slow usually implies that, like, you are slowly working towards something. And, like, they weren't. Like, nothing happens. Like, conversations, like, short, normal conversations would take 40 pages because every time there was a line of dialogue, the main character would just spend 3 pages after that discussing the line of dialogue, discussing what the character truly meant and how their backstory influenced that line of dialogue and all the trauma that they've been through and like what they're wearing and how that like relates and like literally every like it would be 40-page conversations just because of that. Like, it was painful to get through this book. And then you finally get to the climax. And the climax, after this, like, 450-page book, the climax is 4 pages long. And then the main character passes out in the middle of it. So then it just gets summed up to her later. And, like, I don't understand. Like, all of the books in the Case Scarpetta series cannot be this bad. Like, it's not possible. I read the first one. It was not this bad. Like, I didn't enjoy it, but it wasn't like it was painful to read. It was just kind of like slightly shy of mediocre for me. This was painful to read. This was awful. This will probably be on my worst books of the year list. I hated this. I hated this. Like, they can't all be this bad. This had to be a particularly bad one. But I don't think I can ever read Patricia Cornwell again because I had to suffer through this whole book and nothing happened. Nothing happened. Like, I wish I was exaggerating. Like, 300 pages in and she's just finishing looking at the body in the field. Like, has not made it back to the police station yet. It takes place in less than 24 hours. Most of it takes place in about 12 hours overnight. It was unpleasant. I wouldn't recommend this. I'm sure there are other better books in the series. I'm sure this was just a low point, but like, it was not a fun read. Then I listened to Say Nothing, A True Story of Murder and Memory in Northern Ireland by Patrick Radden Keefe. This is a nonfiction historical about the IRA in the 60s and 70s and 80s, I believe, up through present day. But, like, it largely focuses on, like, I think the 70s. I gave this 4 stars. It was really wonderful. I read Empire of Pain last year by this author and really loved it, put it on my favorites list. I only gave it 4 stars, but I feel like I might have underrated it. Like, I maybe could have given that book 5 stars. This was definitely 4 stars. I loved this. This was so good. It was so fascinating to listen to. Like, it's just about the IRA. It kind of focuses on a couple of major players and like their stories, their lives, what they went through, what they did in the IRA, what they did after, how being in the IRA affected them. Like, it covers a lot, and it focuses a lot on the murder of Jean McConville, who was a widow and a mother of 10 who was killed by the IRA, and like it talks about her children and her murder and who killed her and like kind of what that meant, and like a lot about like the present day after effects of that, and like it was wonderful. It was just one of those books that like I always wanted to know more. Like, I always wanted to be listening to it. I was always sad when I finished my commute and was like, oh no, I have to turn it off now. Like, I'm not gonna learn any more about this. Like, I always just wanted more because it was so good. My only 2 like issues with this book, which like were why it got down to 4, I always wanted more than this book was giving me. And there's like a level of feeling that in nonfiction that's good. Like, I want to be reading a nonfiction book and go do research outside of it because I want to know more. But this book, it was like every time I listened to it for a half hour, there were like 8 different things that I needed to Google to like learn more, because like I was really curious about like Bloody Sunday or like whatever, you know, that like weren't really delved into in the book. And I was like so curious and like desperate for more information, and I felt like it was too much for this book. Like, because of the scope of this book, it covered so much information, but didn't always delve really deep into it. And I feel like it either needed to be like longer and actually include more information, or like be more intentionally limited, so that I wasn't feeling like I was missing out on so much. Because I did kind of feel like I was missing out sometimes, and like I just like I needed more from it, or either like intentionally less to like make it more of like a focused book. And then I did also kind of have an issue. A lot of this book at the end is about Gerry Adams, who is or was a politician in Northern Ireland, who was a part of the IRA. And Keefe talks about Adams a lot, like in the earlier part of the book, just like as a member of the IRA and what he did in the IRA, and like, you know, he was kind of commanding some people and whatever. And that was fine. And then you get to the end and it's like Adams is fully denying ever being in the IRA. And it's not that I don't believe Keefe, because like dude was clearly in the IRA. It's just like I wish I'd known earlier on that some of the things were disputed. Like it's kind of about like perspective. Like I think everything Keefe wrote was true. Like he had a lot of interviews with a lot of different people who were saying like the same things, and Adams was the only dissenting voice. So it's like I fully like am on this side of things. But it's like kind of about having perspective, and for reading that, I wish I'd had a different one, and I wish I'd known more, you know, about like kind of the modern day side of things when I was reading about the past side of things, if that makes sense. I didn't really like the way it made me feel misled, even if like I did fully believe like Keefe. I'm not like doubting that. Like I want to be very clear, like I'm not doubting anything Keefe wrote. It's just like I wish I'd had a different perspective while reading it than what I had. But it was wonderful. It was fascinating. Like if you're at all interested in the IRA, 100% read this book. It was so good. It was absolutely wonderful. I loved it. I need to read more by him because I think he's going to be a favorite nonfiction author for me. And then I read Kindred by Octavia Butler because everyone was talking about this because the show just came out, I think, and I'm not gonna watch the show, but like it kept just like reminding me that I really wanted to read this book, so I did. This is about a woman in the 70s who is just living her life in the 70s with her white husband. They're in an interracial marriage, and she gets randomly sucked back in time to the early 1800s to a slave plantation where she meets people who she believes are her ancestors, and she kind of has to save the life of this young boy throughout his life. And she'll like randomly go back to her present for a while and then just get sucked back into time again, and it's very traumatic because like she is a Black woman getting pulled into the enslaved period and like becoming a slave herself, and it's really traumatic and heartbreaking. I gave this 4 stars. I loved the story of this, and the characters, like it was so absorbing. Like I fell in love, I was obsessed, like I was just devouring this book. Like I never wanted to put it down. It was fascinating, and it was so well constructed in terms of like the plot and the story, and like I loved it. I really, really loved it. My main issue was kind of just like the writing style that I didn't love. It was a little bit too minimal for me. It was very dialogue heavy, and I just wanted more from it. Like it was kind of a short book, and it felt kind of brief, and like I loved everything that happened, but I wish there'd just been a little bit more like time to deal with it, like more writing, more reflection, more time in the present perhaps, because there wasn't a whole lot of time in the present, and like things aren't really explored to the depth that they could have been. And like I love this book, but I do feel like it could have been a favorite had there just been like a little bit more. But I thoroughly enjoyed this, and the ending was just like so good. I don't want to talk like in detail about the ending obviously, but it left such a bitter taste in my mouth, and I loved it. Like it was perfect for this book, and Octavia Butler does not pull her punches, and I love her for that, and this was fantastic. Like I'm so glad I finally picked it up. Again, I wish it had taken that like extra step, because like it was a great fantastic book, but like it could have been 5 stars, and it was just a little bit short, and that breaks my heart because it was wonderful. And then I read Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi, which was for my 12-book project. This was recommended to me by my best friend, who really loved this and sobbed, I think, while reading it. I gave this 4 stars. This is a story about a coffee shop in Japan where you can travel back in time for basically the length of time that your coffee is hot. Like they pour you a cup of coffee, and you come back to the present when your coffee gets cold, essentially. And you can't really change much in the past. You can only like be in the cafe. You can't move from your seat in the cafe, and nothing about the present will change based on what you do in the past. Like if someone is dead in the present, there's nothing you can do to change that. But you can change the future in a way. Like you can change like the experience you had with the past. You can change the information you had. You can change your perspective, you know. And it like it does matter. Like even if you can't like change the present, it does matter. It can change you. It's really beautiful. It's such a lovely bittersweet book. I cried at like 3 of the 4 stories in this, and it was lovely. It's definitely one I'd recommend if you like kind of quiet, bittersweet stories about like people and their lives and just like what they're going through. And it was a little bit tragic, but mostly just like it kind of hits that spot in your soul that just like it's sad, but it feels good. I did not connect to this as much as I wanted to. Like I really wanted to fall in love with this book, and like I did really enjoy it and I would recommend, but like I don't know, there was just like a slight disconnect for me of like I didn't adore this. I didn't like, I wanted this to be a favorite, and it's not a favorite. It was just like a really enjoyable book that, to be honest, I will probably never think about again, which was not really the experience I was looking for here. But I would really recommend. It was absolutely lovely. And then the last book I read in March was Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. This is a cozy fantasy about an orc who decides to stop fighting, stop traveling, stop basically killing monsters for money is her job. And she moves to a nice city and opens a coffee shop and has kind of quiet little adventures as she like builds her coffee shop to a successful business. I gave this 3 stars. It was lovely. It was nice. I really liked his writing style. His writing style was really fantastic and like made me enjoy this a lot more than I thought I would, because it is a very like not much happens. It's not really about anything except like these people, but his writing style was really lovely and just like made this compelling even when like the story itself was kind of just about the coffee shop. So loved that. Loved the writing. What I didn't love was really how much of the focus of this book was on the coffee shop, because that was like the main plot, the main story, the main focus, and kind of everything else took a backseat to that. Like the characters, their development, their motivations, their relationships was all kind of secondary to the story of the coffee shop itself, which I didn't love. I felt like if it had been switched, this could have easily been 4 stars for me. It was just like there wasn't enough about the characters. Like they were cool characters. I really liked them, but it's just like I wanted a whole lot more from them. And like had it been just slightly less about the plot of the coffee shop, it may have had time to like develop them more and like develop relationships more, because there's a romantic relationship in this book that just like got almost no development on the page. It was just they were suddenly into each other, which is like fine, but I really wanted to love it and fall in love with them, and I didn't. And I don't know, it wasn't like bad by any means. I really enjoyed it. Like I get why people love this, but it fell a little short for me because of that. Like with Before the Coffee Gets Cold, it's all set in a coffee shop, and the coffee shop is very important, but it's not like the focus of the story. Like it's not the plot of the story. It's just kind of like the vehicle for telling the story of these characters and their lives. And I feel like this book didn't really pull that off as well. It was much more literally about like building the coffee shop, buying the building, hiring employees, training people to work with coffee, advertising, you know, like, and it's just like I was a little bit bored and I really didn't care. And his writing style made me want to care, but it was still a really enjoyable read. I don't think I would pick up the sequel because I think he's writing a sequel. I just don't care that much. But it was a really nice, lovely read. I'm glad I read it. Like I didn't think I was gonna come away from this glad that I read this book, but I really, really did. So it was lovely. So that was everything that I read in the month of March. Let me know down below if you read any of these books, what you thought of them if you have, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.